The morning rain in Silver Oaks didn't fall so much as it drifted, a fine, cold mist that clung to the manicured hedges and dampened the black asphalt of the winding cul-de-sacs. Marcus Vance adjusted the hood of his charcoal gray sweatshirt, his sneakers hitting the pavement with a rhythmic, disciplined thud that matched the steady beat of his heart. To any passerby, he was just another anonymous jogger, a tall black man in salt and pepper stubble lost in the endorphin high of a 6-mile run. He liked the anonymity. In the courtroom, his every word was weighted, parsed by lawyers and etched into the public record by court reporters. But out here, under the gray canopy of the Georgia sky, he was just a man breathing in the damp air. He slowed his pace as he approached the Golden Crumb, a high-end bakery that anchored the neighborhood's small, exclusive commercial strip. The smell of expensive espresso and burnt sugar wafted through the air, clashing with the metallic scent of the rain. Marcus stopped near the curb to stretch his hamstrings, leaning his hand lightly against the fender of a pristine, white SUV to steady himself. He didn't think twice about it, it was a subconscious gesture of a tired athlete. The driver's side door of the SUV swung open with a violent force that nearly clipped his shoulder. Eleanor Sterling stepped out, her movements sharp and jagged with caffeine and unearned authority. She was draped in a cream-colored wool coat that probably cost more than a public defender's monthly salary, her blonde hair styled into a rigid, unmoving bob. The moment her eyes landed on Marcus, her face didn't just register surprise. It curdled into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. She didn't see a neighbor. She didn't even see a human being. She saw a threat to the aesthetic of her morning. "What do you think you're doing?" she snapped, her voice cutting through the quiet morning like a jagged blade. She didn't wait for an answer. She lunged toward him, her manicured hand clutching her designer bag to her chest as if she expected him to snatch it and run into the mist. "Get your hands off my car. Right now." Marcus straightened up, keeping his hands visible and his palms open. He'd seen this look 1,000 times from the bench, the frantic, wide-eyed gaze of someone who had convinced themselves they were the hero of a story that didn't exist. "I apologize, ma'am. I was just stretching. I didn't mean any harm." "Harm? Look at you!" Eleanor shrieked, her voice rising an octave, vibrating with a performative terror that was designed to be heard by the patrons inside the bakery. "You're lurking. You're casing the neighborhood. I know your type. You think because it's raining and nobody is around, you can just help yourself to whatever you want?" "I live 3 blocks away, on Crescent Drive," Marcus said, his voice dropping into the low, resonant baritone he used to settle a rowdy gallery. It was a calm, steady sound, but to Eleanor, his composure was an insult. It was a refusal to play the role of the submissive culprit she had already cast him in. "Crescent Drive? Please," she scoffed, a cruel, mocking laugh bubbling up in her throat. She pulled her smartphone from her pocket, her thumb hovering over the screen with a trembling, frantic energy. "You people are all the same. You lie like you breathe. I'm calling the police. I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person is prowling around our homes." Mr. Henderson, the owner of the bakery, stepped out onto the sidewalk, wiping his hands on a flour-dusted apron. He looked at Eleanor, a regular who spent $40 a day on sourdough and tarts, and then at the man in the damp hoodie. The choice was easy for him. "Is there a problem, Eleanor?" he asked, his tone already accusatory as he glared at Marcus. "Do I need to call security? We don't want any trouble around the shop, especially not from vagrants." Marcus felt the familiar, cold weight of injustice settling in his chest. It wasn't anger. Anger was a luxury he couldn't afford in this skin. It was a profound, weary sadness. He looked at the white SUV, then at the woman recording him with a smug, triumphant sneer, and finally at the shopkeeper who had judged him within a fraction of a second. "I'm going to finish my run now," Marcus said quietly, his eyes locking onto Eleanor's with an intensity that finally made her flinch. "But you should be careful what you wish for, madam. The world is a much smaller place than you think, and the truth has a funny way of standing up just when you think you've buried it." As he turned to jog away, Eleanor's voice followed him, a shrill, piercing sound that echoed off the brick walls of the bakery. "Run away. That's right, run. But I have your face on video. You're finished in this town." Marcus didn't look back. He just kept his pace steady, his mind already shifting from the sting of the sidewalk to the weight of the gavel he would be holding in exactly 2 hours. He knew something she didn't. He knew that by noon, their roles would be very, very different. The fluorescent lights of the law school library hummed with a low, persistent buzz that seemed to vibrate inside Marcus's skull. It was 2 in the morning, 20 years ago, and the air smelled of stale coffee and old parchment. Marcus sat at a corner table, his eyes burning as he squinted at a heavy volume of constitutional law. His hands were rough, the skin calloused from a 12-hour shift moving crates at the shipyard before his evening classes. He remembered the feeling of the loose change in his pocket, 34 cents, his total net worth until his next paycheck. He had skipped dinner to buy a used highlighter. Poverty wasn't just a lack of money, it was a constant, gnawing exhaustion that sat in the marrow of his bones. Across the library, a different world existed. Eleanor Sterling, then a 21-year-old with a pearls and pastels wardrobe, sat with a group of friends, their laughter sharp and careless. To Eleanor, law school was a finishing school, a place to pass the time before joining her father's multi-million-dollar real estate empire. She looked over at Marcus, her lip curling in a subtle, practiced sneer. To her, he wasn't a fellow student, he was an intruder, a diversity statistic who didn't belong in the hallowed halls where her family's name was etched into the donor plaques. The trouble had started over a missing laptop. Eleanor had left her silver MacBook on a table, and when she couldn't find it 10 minutes later, she didn't look for it. She didn't check her car or her bag. She simply pointed. She pointed at the only person in the room who looked like he needed the money. Marcus remembered the dean's office, the cold sweat pooling at the small of his back as Eleanor stood there, her eyes welling with fake, practiced tears. She told the administration that she had seen Marcus lurking near her desk, that he looked suspicious and uncomfortable in such a prestigious environment. The accusation had been a surgical strike, nearly ending his career before it began. Even after the laptop was found wedged between the seats of her own SUV, Eleanor never apologized. She simply rolled her eyes and walked away, annoyed that her drama had been cut short. Marcus's mind drifted even further back, to the sound of a heavy push broom dragging across linoleum floors. His father had been the night janitor at the county courthouse, a man who wore a blue work shirt with Elias stitched over the heart. Every night, Elias would stand in the empty courtrooms, looking up at the judge's bench with a quiet, holy reverence. He would tell Marcus that the law was the only place where a poor man could stand as tall as a king, provided the person holding the gavel had a heart made of iron and a soul made of light. "Don't ever let them make you feel small, Marcus," his father would say, leaning on the broom handle. "The robe doesn't make the man, the character does." The memory snapped like a dry twig as the present rushed back in. Marcus was no longer the tired student or the janitor's son. He stood in his private chambers, the air smelling of polished mahogany and expensive leather. He reached for his judicial robe, the heavy black fabric feeling like a suit of armor as he pulled it over his shoulders. He zipped it up, the sound of the metal teeth clicking into place like a countdown. He caught his reflection in the mirror, the gray hair at his temples, the steady, unshakable gaze of a man who had seen the worst of humanity and decided to be the best of it. His assistant, Sarah, tapped lightly on the door frame, her face pale as she held a digital tablet. She hesitated, looking at the docket for the morning session. She mentioned that the first case was a high-profile civil suit, a nuisance complaint that had been making local headlines. Marcus didn't need to look at the screen. He already knew. He picked up the manila folder from his desk, the name Eleanor Sterling printed in bold, black ink. The ghost of that library girl was waiting for him in his courtroom, still arrogant, still convinced that the world owed her a front row seat. Marcus took a long, slow breath, feeling the weight of his father's words and the sting of those 34 cents. He adjusted his collar, turned off the light, and stepped out into the hallway, his footsteps echoing with the power of a man who was finally ready to settle a 20-year-old debt. The air inside courtroom 4B was thick with the scent of expensive floor wax and Eleanor Sterling's overbearing floral perfume. She sat at the plaintiff's table, looking every bit the victim she imagined herself to be. She wore a pristine white power suit, her legs crossed at the ankles, as she checked her gold watch with a theatrical sigh of impatience. Beside her, her attorney, Mr. Thorne, was busy straightening a stack of documents, his face set in a mask of aggressive confidence. Eleanor leaned over to him, whispering loud enough for the first row of the gallery to hear that she hoped this wouldn't take all day because she had a lunch reservation at the club. When the heavy oak doors at the front of the room swung open, the bailiff's voice boomed through the chamber, commanding everyone to rise. Eleanor didn't stand immediately. She lingered for a second, finishing a text message on her phone before sliding it into her bag with a smirk. She smoothed her hair, expecting to see the usual elderly, balding judge she had played golf with in the past. But as the figure in black silk climbed the steps to the bench, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The Honorable Judge Marcus Vance didn't look at the gallery as he sat down. He adjusted his sleeves, placed a leather-bound notebook on the mahogany surface, and finally looked out into his court. The moment Eleanor lifted her gaze and locked eyes with the man behind the bench, the smirk didn't just fade, it vanished as if it had been struck from her face. Her jaw didn't just drop, it hung slack, her mouth forming a silent, perfect circle of horror. The vagrant from the bakery, the threat to the community she had filmed and insulted only 2 hours ago, was now sitting beneath the great seal of the state. She fumbled for her water glass, her hand trembling so violently that the ice clinked against the crystal like a frantic heartbeat. She looked at Thorne, her eyes wide and pleading, trying to find words that wouldn't come. Marcus, however, remained a statue of professional indifference. He didn't acknowledge the morning's rain or the insults. He simply opened the file and began the proceedings in a voice that was as smooth and cold as tempered steel. Mr. Thorne stood up, oblivious to his client's impending nervous breakdown. He launched into a scathing opening statement, describing the nonprofit youth center as a blight on the neighborhood. He used words like loitering, unpredictable elements, and deterioration of property values. Every time he spoke, Eleanor flinched, feeling the weight of the judge's silent gaze. She felt isolated, a small, shrinking figure in a very large room, realizing for the first time that her wealth offered no protection against the man she had treated like trash. In the back of the room, sitting quietly on a wooden bench, was a young man named Leo. He was a volunteer at the youth center, the same young man Eleanor had tried to have arrested 3 months prior for the crime of sitting on a public bench while wearing a hoodie. He watched the proceedings with a cautious flicker of hope in his eyes. He had seen the way Eleanor looked at people like him, but now he was watching her realize that the person she feared most was the one who held the power of the law. Marcus leaned forward, his shadow stretching across the floor toward the plaintiff's table. He interrupted Thorne's speech with a single, pointed question. He asked Mrs. Sterling to define exactly what she meant by criminal elements, and why she felt that a person's mere presence in a neighborhood constituted a nuisance. The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor looked up at the bench, seeing not just a judge, but the living ghost of every person she had ever looked down upon. The heat of the injustice she had fueled all morning was finally beginning to burn her back. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted from tense to predatory as Mr. Thorne, sensing his client's mounting panic, decided to go on the offensive. He stood up slowly, a shark-like grin spreading across his face, and tapped a silver flash drive against the palm of his hand. He looked up at the bench with a mock reverence that felt like a slap in the face. "Your Honor," he began, his voice dripping with faint concern, "before we proceed with the merits of this nuisance claim, I have a matter of grave importance regarding the court's ability to remain impartial. I've just received a piece of digital evidence that changes everything." Eleanor sat up straighter, her eyes darting to the screen at the front of the room. She knew exactly what was on that drive. Thorne signaled the tech assistant, and a grainy, vertical video began to play. It was the footage Eleanor had recorded that morning. On the high-definition monitors, everyone in the room saw Marcus Vance in his gray hoodie, appearing caught in a confrontation with a screaming Eleanor. The audio was distorted, but her cries of, "Get your hands off my car," and "I'm calling the police," echoed through the silent gallery. Thorne turned to the room, spreading his arms wide. "As you can all see, Judge Vance was involved in a personal altercation with my client just hours ago. He was lurking near her property, acting in a way that can only be described as aggressive. For the judge to remain on this bench would be a travesty of justice. We move for an immediate mistrial and the recusal of Judge Vance." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. It felt like a knockout blow. If Marcus was forced to step down, the case would be handed over to Judge Miller, a man known for his close ties to the Sterling family's real estate empire. The youth center would be closed by sunset. Eleanor leaned over to her lawyer, a smug, venomous smile returning to her lips. She whispered something about how the trash finally got taken out. For a long, agonizing minute, Marcus sat in total silence, his face unreadable. He looked at the video, then at the woman who had recorded it, his fingers laced together on top of the bench. It looked like a total defeat. But then, Marcus leaned into his microphone. His voice didn't shake. It didn't crack. Instead, it took on a resonant, booming quality that seemed to vibrate the very walls. "I've seen the video, Mr. Thorne," he said calmly. "And I find it very interesting that you brought it here. However, what you don't know is that for the past 6 months, I have been working with the City Council on a comprehensive report regarding systemic harassment in the Silver Oaks district. Because of the numerous threats I've received for my work, I don't just jog for my health. I jog for my safety." Marcus reached beneath the bench and pulled out a small, professional-grade body camera, the kind used by law enforcement. He laid it on the mahogany wood with a heavy thud. While Mrs. Sterling was busy recording her version of the truth, my device was recording the reality. It recorded her using racial slurs. It recorded her threatening to use her husband's political influence to destroy a man she thought was a vagrant. And most importantly, it recorded her admitting that she wanted the youth center gone because, and I quote, "she didn't like the way the children looked on her street." The color didn't just drain from Eleanor's face, it vanished, leaving her looking like a marble statue of regret. Marcus stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the plaintiff's table. "Mr. Thorne, I am granting your motion. I will recuse myself from this civil suit to ensure there is no hint of bias." Eleanor let out a small, relieved breath, but it was cut short as Marcus continued. "But since I am no longer the judge on this matter, I am now a private citizen and a primary witness to a crime. I have already contacted the district attorney. This civil suit is now the least of your client's worries, because an investigation into criminal harassment and civil rights violations begins today. I'm not just leaving this bench, Eleanor. I'm coming for the truth." Marcus didn't wait for a response. He stepped down from the bench, his black robes billowing behind him like a dark cloud. He walked past the stunned lawyers and the trembling Eleanor without a second glance. The mindset of the victim had been shed, he was now the hunter. As he exited through the heavy oak doors, the courtroom erupted into chaos, but Marcus was already miles ahead, planning the long game that would bring Eleanor Sterling's world crashing down to the pavement where they had first met. The following weeks were characterized by a deceptive, heavy silence. In the high-walled estates of Silver Oaks, Eleanor Sterling was in high spirits, convinced she had won a war of nerves. She spent her afternoons at the country club, glass of Chardonnay in hand, regaling her inner circle with a dramatized version of how she had forced a sitting judge to tuck tail and run. She described Marcus Vance as a weak man who couldn't handle the heat of a real legal battle, laughing as she checked her reflection in a compact mirror. She truly believed that by forcing his recusal, she had erased him from the board entirely. Her husband, Robert, a man whose influence was woven into the city's zoning boards like a malignant thread, assured her that the youth center case would be buried quietly by a friendly replacement judge. They felt untouchable, basking in the sun of their own perceived invincibility, unaware that the shadow of the mountain was already beginning to move. Across town, in a home office filled with the scent of old books and late-night cedarwood, Marcus Vance was working with the surgical precision of a master architect. He didn't move with anger, he moved with the steady, unstoppable momentum of the truth. His desk was buried under mountains of public records, tax filings, and property deeds. While Eleanor was busy picking out floral arrangements for the upcoming City Founders Gala, Marcus was connecting the dots between her family's real estate holdings and a series of illegal redlining practices that had kept minority families out of Silver Oaks for decades. He worked until his eyes burned and the sun began to peek through the blinds, fueled by a quiet dignity that Eleanor could never understand. He wasn't just building a case, he was dismantling an empire. There were secret meetings in the back of dimly lit diners, where Marcus met with retired city planners and disgruntled former employees of Sterling Development. He listened to stories of intimidation, of families being priced out of their homes by unforeseen fee hikes, and of documents being shredded in the middle of the night. Each testimony was a brick in the wall he was building around Eleanor's life. He coordinated with the district attorney's office, handing over encrypted files and time-stamped recordings from his body camera. He was the ghost in the machine, a silent force of nature that Eleanor had mistaken for a passing breeze. Subtle hints of the turning tide began to appear, though Eleanor was too blinded by her own arrogance to notice. Her husband's phone calls began to go unreturned. A few high-profile lawyers suddenly found themselves too busy to take on her secondary countersuits. Even the local shopkeeper, Mr. Henderson, seemed unusually nervous when she walked into the bakery, his eyes darting to the floor instead of meeting hers. But Eleanor simply snapped her fingers and demanded her usual order, chalking up the tension to the low-class energy she claimed was infecting the neighborhood. She was so focused on looking down that she never thought to look up and see the hammer as it reached the apex of its swing. Marcus watched from the shadows, patient and resolute, knowing that the most effective trap is the one the prey helps build with their own pride. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a sea of shimmering silk, sparkling crystal, and the thick, cloying scent of status. It was the night of the City Founders Gala, the most exclusive event of the year, where the air was kept at a crisp 68 degrees and the champagne flowed like a river of liquid gold. Eleanor Sterling stood near the grand staircase, draped in a gown of midnight blue sequins that caught the light with every practiced toss of her head. She held a flute of crystal, her pinky finger extended, as she held court with a circle of the city's most influential socialites. She felt like a queen on the eve of her coronation, especially tonight, as she was slated to receive the Civic Pride Award for her supposed contributions to neighborhood safety. The room was a symphony of high society clatter, the sharp click of stilettos on marble, the polite, hollow laughter of men in $5,000 tuxedos, and the hushed whispers of deals being made in the corners. Eleanor glanced at her watch, a diamond-encrusted piece that glittered under the chandeliers. She was basking in the glow of her perceived victory, convinced that the unpleasantness with the jogger had been successfully buried. Her husband, Robert, stood beside her, adjusting his cufflinks with a smug expression, looking every bit the power broker who had silenced a scandal. They were the golden couple of the evening, the untouchables. Then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom opened, and a figure stepped into the light. Marcus Vance didn't creep in, he arrived. He was dressed in a tailored black tuxedo that fit his broad frame with military precision, his white shirt crisp against the darkness of the suit. He looked like a man who owned the room, not a man who was crashing it. As he walked through the crowd, the sea of silk parted before him. People stopped mid-sentence, their glasses pausing halfway to their lips. There was an undeniable gravity to him, a quiet power that seemed to dim the glitter of the room. Eleanor spotted him from across the floor, and her face instantly soured. She didn't feel fear yet, only a sharp, stinging annoyance that he had the audacity to show his face in her world. She whispered something biting to her husband and began to weave through the crowd, her heels clicking a rhythmic warning on the floor. She met Marcus near the fountain in the center of the room, blocking his path with a sneer that she didn't bother to hide. "I have to hand it to you, Marcus," she said, her voice dripping with a condescending sweetness that felt like poison. "You certainly have nerve, but this isn't a public park or a courtroom you can hide behind. This is a gathering of the people who actually run this city. A witness has no power in a room full of giants." She looked him up and down, her eyes lingering on his shoes as if looking for a speck of dirt to mock. "Did you save up your little government salary for that suit? Or is it a rental?" Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply looked down at her with a calm, almost pitying expression that made Eleanor's blood boil. "The thing about giants, Eleanor," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that carried over the music, is that they have a very long way to fall. And the higher they climb on a mountain of lies, the harder the impact when the ground finally gives way. He checked his watch, a simple, rugged timepiece that stood in stark contrast to the jewelry around them. "It's 7:45, he remarked quietly. "You should enjoy the music while it's still playing. Once the silence starts, it tends to be quite permanent." Before she could snap back a retort, Marcus gave her a polite, formal nod and walked toward the stage, where the district attorney was already adjusting the microphone. Eleanor watched him go, a sudden, cold prickle of unease dancing down her spine. She looked around the room and noticed that the federal agents who had been stationed near the doors weren't looking at the exits, they were looking at her. Her husband's two-faced business partner, a man who had been laughing with them moments ago, suddenly turned his back and began an urgent conversation with someone else. The atmosphere in the room was shifting, the warmth of the gala curdling into something icy and expectant. The trap was set, the guests were all in their places, and the man she had called a vagrant was about to hand her the bill for 20 years of arrogance. The string quartet at the edge of the stage tapered off into a haunting, final note, leaving the ballroom in a state of expectant silence. Eleanor Sterling smoothed the silk of her midnight blue dress, standing tall and ready to receive the Civic Pride Award. She adjusted her posture, putting on the mask of the humble philanthropist, preparing to walk up those stairs and claim her victory. But the district attorney did not call her name. Instead, he gripped the sides of the podium, his face grim, and looked directly at the center of the room. He spoke into the microphone, his voice amplified until it shook the very chandeliers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "tonight was supposed to be about civic duty. But duty requires integrity, and integrity requires the truth. I would like to invite the man who has spent the last 6 months uncovering the rot beneath our city's foundation to the stage. Please welcome the Honorable Justice Marcus Vance." The room didn't just go quiet, it became a vacuum. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic thud of Marcus's polished dress shoes as he climbed the steps. He took his place behind the microphone, looking out over the crowd of elite power players. He didn't look like the man in the gray hoodie anymore, yet he carried that man's dignity with him. He looked directly at Eleanor, who was frozen at her table, her hand still clutching her wineglass so tightly that her knuckles were as white as bone. Marcus didn't use notes. He didn't need them. 20 years ago, he began, "I sat in a library not far from here, and a young woman tried to take my future away because she didn't like the way I looked. This morning, on a rainy sidewalk in Silver Oaks, that same woman tried to do it again. She called me a vagrant. She called me a threat. She recorded me on her phone, hoping to use the world's prejudice as a weapon to destroy a stranger." Marcus paused, letting the weight of his words sink into the silent room. He then signaled to the technician at the back. Huge projection screens dropped from the ceiling, and suddenly, the ballroom was filled with the sights and sounds of Eleanor's true character. The video wasn't the edited version her lawyer had shown in court. It was the full, unedited body camera footage. The crowd watched in stunned horror as Eleanor's face appeared 10 feet tall, twisted with rage, screaming racial slurs and threatening to use her husband's political connections to ruin the man in the hoodie. But Marcus wasn't finished. The screen flickered, shifting to a series of internal company emails and bank transfers. He began to narrate the evidence with the cold, clinical precision of a high court judge. These documents prove that Sterling Development has been systematically denying housing to minority families for 2 decades. They prove that the nuisance lawsuit against the local youth center was a fraudulent attempt to seize land for a private luxury expansion. The color didn't just leave Eleanor's face, it seemed to leave her entire body. She looked around the room, her eyes darting like a trapped animal, but everywhere she looked, people were turning away. Friends she had known for years suddenly stepped back, creating a physical gap of isolation around her table. Her husband, Robert, tried to stand, his face a mask of panicked denial, but he was stopped by 4 men in dark suits who had emerged from the shadows of the ballroom. They weren't hotel security, they were federal agents. Marcus stepped away from the podium and walked down the stairs, moving slowly until he stood directly in front of Eleanor. The silence was so absolute that the sound of her rapid, shallow breathing was audible to everyone nearby. She tried to speak, her mouth moving in a pathetic, fish-like motion, but no sound came out. She looked at the handcuffs being produced by the agents and then back at Marcus, her eyes filling with a desperate, ugly terror. "You told me earlier this evening that a witness has no power in a room full of giants," Marcus said, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm rumble. "But you forgot one thing, Eleanor. I'm not just a witness. I'm the evidence. And in this room, you aren't a giant. You're just a woman who ran out of people to look down on." He reached into his tuxedo pocket and pulled out the gray hoodie he had been wearing that morning, neatly folded. He laid it on the table in front of her. "You told me I looked like I needed a handout. Keep this. It's the last bit of comfort you're going to have for a very long time." As the agent stepped forward and clicked the steel cuffs around Eleanor's wrists, she finally broke. She didn't go out with dignity. She began to scream, a shrill, hysterical sound that echoed off the marble walls as she was led through the center of the ballroom. She begged for her husband, she begged for her lawyers, she even tried to beg Marcus for mercy, but the room remained a wall of silent, judgmental faces. The Karen of Silver Oaks was gone, replaced by a broken woman being escorted into the back of a black sedan. Marcus stood in the center of the ballroom, his head held high, as the first few claps began to echo through the hall, growing into a thunderous ovation for a man who had finally brought the truth into the light. The dust of the Sterling scandal eventually settled, but the city was never quite the same. The headlines faded from the front pages, yet the impact of that night at the gala vibrated through the streets of Silver Oaks like a low, persistent hum. Eleanor Sterling's assets, once her pride and her shield, were liquidated to pay for a record-breaking civil rights settlement. The Sterling name was chiseled off the wings of hospitals and the plaques of parks, replaced by a silence that felt heavier than any noise. Her husband, Robert, struck a plea deal that saw him serve time in a minimum security facility, but Eleanor's refusal to show remorse during the trial led to a far harsher reality. She was sentenced to 5 years of state time and 500 hours of mandatory community service. Marcus Vance returned to his life with the same quiet discipline that had defined his rise. He didn't seek out the cameras or write a tell-all book about the night he took down the city's golden couple. Instead, he channeled the settlement funds into the youth center, transforming the once-threatened building into a state-of-the-art facility. On its grand opening day, the sun shone brightly on a brass plaque at the entrance that read, "The Elias Vance Center for Justice and Opportunity." He stood in the back of the crowd, watching a new generation of kids run through the doors, knowing his father would have been proud of the legacy built from a janitor's dreams. 5 years passed in the blink of an eye. The neighborhood of Silver Oaks had changed. It was no longer a fortress of exclusion, but a community where the sound of different voices could be heard over the morning mist. On a brisk Tuesday, Marcus was out for his usual morning run, his gray hoodie pulled up against the chill. He rounded the corner near the bakery where his life had collided with Eleanor's half a decade ago. The shop was under new management, and the atmosphere was warmer, the smell of fresh bread welcoming everyone regardless of the car they drove. Near the sidewalk, a group of workers in orange vests was busy clearing debris from a local community garden. Among them was a woman who moved with a slow, heavy fatigue. Her hair, once a perfectly coiffed blonde bob, was now a dull, messy gray tied back in a cheap elastic band. Her skin was weathered by the sun, and the designer wool coat had been replaced by a coarse, stained work jacket. Eleanor Sterling gripped a rusted garden hoe, her hands, once soft and manicured, now covered in the dirt of the very earth she used to think she owned. She paused to wipe sweat from her forehead, her eyes drifting toward a white SUV that had parked nearby. She watched as a young black couple stepped out, laughing as they walked toward the bakery. For a moment, that old flash of bitterness flickered in her eyes, but it was quickly extinguished by a profound, weary sadness. She looked down at her work boots and went back to the soil. She had learned the hard way that when you spend your life trying to bury others, you eventually find yourself in the hole you dug. Marcus slowed his pace as he passed her. He didn't stop to gloat, and he didn't say a word. He simply nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement for a human being who was finally paying her debt to the world. Eleanor looked up and locked eyes with him. There was no screaming this time, no recording on a phone, and no demands to know who he was. She knew exactly who he was. She saw the man she had tried to destroy, and in his calm, steady gaze, she saw the mirror of everything she had lost. The moral of the story is one that echoes through every courtroom and every sidewalk in America. You should never judge a book by its cover, because the person you look down on today might be the one holding the gavel tomorrow. Kindness costs nothing, but arrogance eventually demands everything you have. As Marcus jogged into the distance, his silhouette disappearing into the golden morning light, he left behind a world that was a little more just, a little more kind, and a lot more careful about how it treats a stranger in a hoodie.